Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I'm going to be reviewing Revolutionary Roads, Searching for the War That Made America Independent and All the Places It Could Have Gone Terribly Wrong by Bob Thompson. So this is what the book looks like. It's a little bit thicker, a little bit bigger, and I got this book out in advance of a trip that I took to New England. So I am behind on my book reviews and now I'm reviewing a bunch of books that I've already read. So I did read this book and I also did this in conjunction with an audiobook. So I have the physical print book here and I also had an audiobook that I listened to. I just like to include that because it does kind of affect the review, the way that I consumed the book. So Revolutionary Roads, which is what I'm going to shorten this title to, by Bob Thompson. The first thing I noticed right away when listening/reading this book is if you do choose the audiobook, there's no problem with that. I really enjoyed the narrator of the audiobook, but I think this is a book that I personally would at least want the physical copy present for if I was listening to the audiobook, because there are maps and there are pictures that I feel like I was always wanting to reference or always referencing, which is, if you're just sitting and listening to the audiobook, that's fine, but I was driving for part of this while listening to the audiobook, and I can't exactly like pull this book out while driving and pull one of these. Oh, okay, yeah, I do see, like, I can't do that. So that's just something to know. I do think that the physical, well, I did like the audiobook and the narrator. I think having a copy of the physical book would be helpful when reading this book. So that's a little bit about the way that I consumed this book. And now let's talk about the book itself. So a little bit about my history into my familiarity with the subject of this book. The school that I attended from kindergarten through 12th grade, we had a program where we alternated between American history, I live in the United States, so like our local history for lack of a better term, and world history. So one year would be American, one year would be world. The next year would be American, the next year would be world. And each year as you like progress from like first and second grade, where it was like, this is the capital, this is where France is, like very basic information, to like your senior level of high school where things would be a little bit more complex. So each year kind of built, we would cover the same topic, but a little bit more in depth as the years continued to progress. So that was the way it's set up, which meant that I took American history a number of times, starting at the very beginning where just very basic things were laid out to us all the way through my senior year. I took some world history courses in college, but I did not take any more American history formally in school after completing my high school education, which was a number of years ago at this point. So a lot of this stuff I was familiar with, I knew it, but I had like forgotten it. It's the kind of forget where like the moment someone says something, you remember stuff about it, or you're like, oh, I do remember that. I do remember that content. But because this is material that I haven't reviewed in a while, I had forgotten some of it. But as soon as the stuff was covered in the book, I started remembering a lot of the content a little bit better. When I was going through my K through 12 education, I preferred world history quite a bit more. That's why I took a lot of world history when I was in college. Even though I was a math major, we could take extra classes if we wanted to, and I took a lot of extra history classes because I just enjoyed world history. But I do think that if my American textbook had been as interesting as Bob Thompson makes this book, I would have enjoyed American history a little bit better. There were some aspects I liked about American history, but overall I thought some parts of it were quite dry and boring. But I think it came down to presentation of the material and not just content, because I really did enjoy this book. Because I was going to New England, I wanted a refresher on the Revolutionary War, which took place, quite a bit of it took place in the New England region of America, or like at least along the coast over there. So I knew I was going to be in areas where important battles had taken place or where events in the Revolutionary War had occurred. So I got this book out, and this was probably one of the first books I have read. This is one of the first times I've interacted with American history in this manner, in like an academic setting, since leaving high school, or at least reading a lot of books about it. I did take some trips earlier this year where I went to a lot of Civil War battle sites down in, like, I don't want to say the South, kind of like the Virginia. Basically, I went to a lot of sites in Virginia, and that kind of kickstarted an interest in American history again for me. But this is my first time really interacting with a lot of this material, and I was surprised at how quickly some of it came back, but I was also surprised at how entertaining or how interesting this material can be, because it wasn't always presented in an interesting light when I was in school. And I think that presentation of the material to get students involved, while also imparting the information that they need to learn, is kind of an important part of education. So this book takes place in chronological history, and I'm not going to sit here and recount the Revolutionary War from beginning to end. First of all, because I will probably make mistakes, and second of all, because there's people on YouTube who have already made videos on this who will do it much better than I have. But this book goes through the Revolutionary War in more or less chronological order, and the author takes moments to stop at times that could have been a turning point, kind of asking the what if questions. What if this person hadn't fired into the crowd? What if this event hadn't occurred? What if these people were able to cross this river sooner, later, not at all? Kind of asking the what if questions that are impossible to answer. We don't know what would have happened if this had happened, or if this had occurred, or if this individual had been in a different place at a different time. But I think it kind of opened my eyes to thinking about these situations, as he points in the beginning. Sometimes when we go through history, we view this as like inevitable, like of course the American colonies were going to inevitably break free of their British overlords, but it wasn't necessarily an inevitability, and it wasn't always necessarily a given that they were going to win against the more disciplined, and I would argue probably better resourced, at least overall as like a country, British people. See, I don't want to get too far in the weeds because I don't know all the historical details, obviously. There's real historians who spend their life studying this work, who I'm sure have plenty of YouTube videos that will go more in depth. But it's not an inevitability, and I think that sometimes when we read stuff in history textbooks, it's like this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and there's not a lot of room for what ifs or what could have happened if this had occurred, or those sort of questions are kind of left out. And that's what I found so enjoyable about this book, is him stopping to really examine what happened in certain situations, battles, events, incidents, and really thinking about how that kind of influenced or changed the course of the war and the ultimate result of the war, which would be the American colonies breaking free and forming their own nation. Now, my history book did not cover all this. My history books in K through 12 did not entirely cover all the topics that were mentioned in here, which I really enjoyed. For example, reading a lot about the flaws of George Washington and the flaws of the militia were things that were not covered before. Now, if you ask me point blank, like, did George Washington do everything right during the Revolutionary War? My gut instinct would be like, no, of course not. He's a human. He's not going to do everything correct. But understanding areas that he made the wrong, like, military call or things like that, weren't really necessarily highlighted in my textbooks growing up. So I feel like including that here was interesting. And also hearing a lot about the militia and how poorly sometimes the militia performed. I feel like it was just kind of glanced over in a lot of my history textbooks. But reading about that in this book was quite interesting. I feel like the author also was able to inject a lot of humor into this situation, or into the stories, without taking away from the seriousness of what was happening. This is war. People are dying. There are atrocities being committed. And he's able to bring a little bit of humor into the situation without taking away from the seriousness, which I feel like is always a fine line to walk. You don't want to be too flippant with something like a war, because people died and horrible things happened during the war. But war is also, at least in this instance, we're reflecting on something, we're asking what if questions, and I feel like he's able to bring an appropriate amount of humor without, again, detracting from the seriousness of the situation, which I really appreciated. I would definitely read more books by Bob Thompson. I really appreciated the work that he did in this book. And I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised. I was reading this mostly for education about the Revolutionary War and the regions I was going to be visiting. I wasn't really expecting to be highly entertained, but I really enjoyed this, even for someone whose American history knowledge was a little bit fuzzy, and I didn't know I had such a strong interest in it. So this definitely is inspiring me to read more about things like the Revolutionary War, which was definitely an outcome I didn't expect from this book. I think this book would be perfect for someone who would be planning a trip. I think if you're looking for like a textbook, strictly the facts, no nonsense book about the Revolutionary War, this might not be for you, both due to like the way that he's moving from situation to situation, and also like the humorous moments, and there's not like tons of battle maps and plans. I feel like if that's more the book you're looking for, this might not be the book for you. I think this book was actually perfect for what I wanted, and for people who maybe just want a refresher on the American Revolution, people who just want a refresher in the regions that they live, people who never have, maybe if you don't have any familiarity with the Revolutionary War, I might suggest starting somewhere else, because there is some tacit implication that you understand a little bit of what's happening in the Revolutionary War. I think this is written to either an American audience or someone who has done a little bit of reading or a little bit of world history studying and understands the American Revolution, at least a little bit. But it's perfect for also people like me who wanted to go on trips, who want to see things, who want to know what's happening in the region, because the author spent a lot of time visiting different regions that he wrote about in the book, going to see historical markers, explaining where they were, going to different parks and speaking with different guides. And I feel like it's really good for people who also want to do that sort of stuff, because he's telling you where he went and who he talked to and where the historical markers are, as well as what happened at that historical marker, to give you that context. And that's why I feel like this book is also, it's good for people who want to do that sort of traveling. So if you have a trip planned and you want to see some sites from the Revolutionary War, this might definitely be a book to check out. If you want a refresher of your American history and you haven't touched it in a decade, then this might be a good book for you to check out. If you want to kind of explore some hypothetical what ifs, or think about what were some turning points in the Revolutionary War, this might be an interesting book for you. I think this was really well done. It exceeded my expectations. Again, I just kind of was looking for some educational knowledge about the Revolutionary War, and I got more than bargained for in a good way. And so I was pleasantly surprised, and I love being pleasantly surprised by books. So great job. I really appreciate Bob Thompson writing this book, and I will definitely see what else he's written, because I had such a great time reading / listening to this book. If you've read Revolutionary Roads, if you've read any books like it, if you have any thoughts on this, please put it in the comments below. I'd love to get your comments. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.